let's bring in Aditya Saraswat now, who's Research Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Rystad Energy. Great to have you on Global Business Europe. So, look, why does the UAE leaving OPEC matter? What actually changes here?
I think first of all, UAE is a very important member which has significant actionable market-ready production capacity, which essentially shoulders any sort of market exercise regarding supply production increase and cuts. So with UAE leaving, you have left behind Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and to some extent Oman with some actionable capacity left. Because for the other nations, most of them are catching up to their reference levels, and others are bounded by the domestic production levels, domestic production feeds, which essentially leaves behind any actionable capacities within the region. So what that does is any sort of meaningful production exercise in the future largely gets limited to Saudi Arabia only. Yes, sorry.
No, go on.
And I think this is arguably more consequential than the volumes of barrels involved. The organization's ability to act as a credible market stabilizer largely sit on this surplus capacity, which gets eroded away by 25% with the exit of the UAE.
So do you think that OPEC Plus, so that's the OPEC plus Russia, is it now effectively a Saudi-Russia alliance rather than the broader grouping of oil-producing nations?
I think there are still members within the Middle East region and some African members which are producing meaningful cuts. But I think when we talk about sizable gains and production gains and reduction capabilities, those are largely sitting with Saudi Arabia and to some extent Russia. Because there is a cap on any sort of takeaway capacities increment in Iraq. We are seeing some declining capacities in Kuwait. So in the long term, it's largely sitting with Saudi Arabia and Russia.
How quickly do you think that this could feed in to global supply?
Strait of Hormuz is masking any sort of supply additions as we speak. The recovery, even if the both sides shake hands today, we are expecting the recovery to start even if by middle of June and July, you could see normalization happening by end of this year. So any sort of meaningful addition coming out of UAE, which is holding up close to 1.4 million barrel per day of surplus capacities, which can be readily brought to the market, could actually, in essence, start from 2027. But we also have to be mindful that up until now, including the inventory releases, we have lost 1 billion barrel of crude, and by the time everything normalizes, we would lose another billion barrels. So to compensate for that, we can safely assume close to 2 to 3 million barrel per day of additional liquid supply, which essentially absorbs any sort of supply additions coming from the UAE. So in the long run, essentially in 2027 and beyond, the increased demand to replenish the inventories globally could absorb these UAE surplus capacities. And despite UAE addition, we were seeing surplus capacity, surplus market, and we would see it happening again. So altogether, by the virtue of the events and the stabilization forces following the normalization, the impact would not be readily felt by the market as and when the supply ramps up from the UAE.